Welcome again. My name is Barbara Bochelome. I'm the founder and executive director of Sustainable Performance Institute. We are a national nonprofit that works with organizations to help them institutionalize sustainability. I'm a recovering architect, and in my experience, really what helps organizations be successful is less reliance on deep technical knowledge and more the human aspects of leadership and communication and all these things that make sustainability actually possible. So that's what we focus on. And we work with companies and help them manage the changes that they need to do to be able to implement these kinds of programs. And we offer a lot of different services for that, many of them free resources. If you happen to have an office that has multiple offices or an office located in Massachusetts, during the pandemic, a small silver lining has been the Workforce Training Grant Program. This is money from the state of Massachusetts that goes to companies who want training. And these trainings could be in sustainability or any topic, and they are free. Some of the workforce grant provides up to $250,000 worth of training to your organization. And the small business grant is for an office located in Massachusetts with 100 or fewer employees. And it gives you access to all this training. And your office doesn't have to be the only office. You can have a headquarters or offices in other places. So that's just a great resource to know about. And lastly, our next two upcoming webinars, this is part of our Building the Future series. And the next two webinars, the dates will be released, but you see the bit.ly URL at the bottom. You can sign up and you'll get notified when the webinars are going to happen. The first one is Dr. Greg Norris, who is at Harvard School of Public Health and the chief scientist for Living Futures Institute. And he's going to be talking about going from footprint to handprint, a positive approach to managing carbon and life cycle analysis. And he's fantastic. That's going to be great. Very inspiring. And in mid-January, we're having a webinar, a three-part webinar series that's focusing on the AIA 2030 commitment program, which is a voluntary program for mostly architecture firms who are working towards eliminating carbon from their portfolios. 27 firms in 2019 were successful and reduced the energy consumption of portfolio-wide of their projects by 70% in 2019. And that's really, really impressive. So we're going to be hearing from them and their kind of secrets of success and lessons learned. So thanks for joining today. And last but not least, I'm really excited that we have this amazing panel today. When you registered, you read their full bio, so I'm not going to regurgitate that. But we're really lucky to have Audi, Matt, Harry, and Stuart here today, who represent different perspectives and viewpoints into this issue of managing tenants and creating relationships with between landlord and tenant that are mutually beneficial. Hi. Oops, can someone please put themselves on mute if you're not on mute? Great, thank you. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I am going to let Audi take over.
Thank you so much. That was a great introduction. And thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm very excited to jump into a very informative panel discussion. But first, I kind of want to reflect on the year and just kind of level set here. We're talking about, most of 2020, the real estate has essentially been rocked off balance by a virus that has vacated the majority of commercial buildings across the United States. And some might have guessed that maybe this would have been a short instance in time, but it's really bleeding into a year and potentially more. And so as occupancy is low in buildings, building operators must maintain temperature and health protocols, which often create challenges because of established language in lease clauses, which provide minimum clauses, and we'll get into that in a second. And actually, this Tuesday, I read an article that highlights findings from about 200 commercial real estate executives that Deloitte spoke with as they established their 2021 outlook. And the trend was, it talks about how rental pricing is going down and the increase of cost is going up because of implementing health and safety standards to combat the pandemic. And there was a lot to unpack in that particular article, but it really talks about what's happening in the lease space related to how we address resiliency in office buildings today. And so
Audie, hold on a sec. You're muted accidentally. Sorry, folks, just there. Go ahead.
all right, okay. So I'm going to share my screen and talk a little bit about buildings first. So give me 1 second. A lot of buttons here. Technology here.
Oh, if there's anything I can do to help. Ah, there we go.
There we go.
Okay.
Okay, do you see
Yes.
wide building emissions?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, fantastic. So when we're talking about buildings, and part of the reason why we're talking about them today is when we break down where carbon emissions come from, the lion's share really comes from buildings. And it's more than transportation, it's more than agriculture and industrial, which sorry about that. And so when we're looking into more detail about why and how we can address efficiency in buildings, really when you come down to the lease space, it's about who controls the energy in the building. And in most cases, building consumption is kind of 50-50, but in major cities, you're going to see more tenants have control of the building energy use, and sometimes it can be upwards of 80% tenant controlled energy versus landlord control. And so we're talking about base building, common area versus tenant spaces. And so how do you address that? Typically, traditional leases really don't prioritize how to improve efficiency. But one of the areas that we're going to talk about today is green leasing, and how green leasing really is a tool to start to address efficiency, to address health and wellness, and resiliency as we try to get people back into the office. And so what a green lease does, or you can even call it high performance lease or an energy aligned lease, whatever your preference is, it essentially creates a win-win agreement between landlord and tenant to incorporate efficiency, health, wellness, water into the lease. And it does that in an equitable fashion. So the cost and benefit equitably between landlord and tenant. And what that does, it eliminates what's called a split incentive issue. And the split incentive essentially says one party pays for an efficiency upgrade and the other party benefits from that upgrade, whether it's operational savings or other. So by eliminating that, and then we look at how does that equate in dollars and cents, for example. Well, it can come up to about 11 to 22% energy savings in a building, which equates to about 51 cents per square foot savings, which is a decent amount of savings, right? But what actually goes into a green lease? It's not just a set of clauses, it's a whole process. So again, it's a binding document that establishes, one, the priorities of the two parties. So landlord owner has priorities, tenant has priorities. In a green lease, we're trying to merge them and find the right solutions together. Typically, this happens before the lease is signed. And then a point of contact. Traditional leases usually have the real estate person or a leasing person as a point of contact. And I think one of the things that we found during the pandemic,
delivery of that piece of equipment.
Can the person that just joined mute, please?
Nitrogen refrigerator currently.
Barbara, do you have control? Yeah, thank you. And so what we found is that a lot of property managers were having a hard time finding the right point of contact because it wasn't established early on. So Green Lease starts to address those and creates a cadence when a landlord and tenant and the point of context communicate about efficiency opportunities. The other is prioritizing environmental, health, and social, whatever those priorities are in lease terms. But we all know that what's in a lease can get forgotten. A green lease addresses that and sets standards, policies, operational guidelines that both parties understand how those priorities will actually be played out through the length of the lease. And then lastly, I think this is one of the most important parts, is language or process that allows either party to report against the progress made in that building. So those priorities that were established early on, how do you track and report progress over time? All right, so those were the basics. Let me stop sharing here and then we'll get started into, the panel discussion. All right, so today, what do we want to talk about? Well, we're talking about resiliency in lease space, and how does leasing and leasing transactions between a landlord and tenant can address operational resiliency, market recovery, bringing tenants back to the buildings, and find the right balance of health, energy efficiency, and cost-saving potentials. I would love to get started first by going around to the panelists. If you don't mind just kind of jumping in, and just maybe we'll start with you, Harry, about what are the major focus that you've had on your plate over the last 4 months related to leasing and efficiency?
Yeah, and thanks, Audi and Barbara. It's great to be here with this panel and kind of talking about this critical topic in sort of the midst of the pandemic, but really sort of looking further out and the implications for what companies, landlords, tenants want to do as it relates to climate change and resiliency, that sort of to really frame this conversation and really reflecting on the last 4 months. Some of the big themes we've seen and the work that we've done in our advisory practice really segment in 2 ways. One, as it relates to clients who've had green lease clauses, who have green leasing as part of their standard practice. This is the chance to leverage those and kind of really put them into action. As you noted, the comment around having a sustainability contact, that cannot be underlooked in terms of importance. When everything happened, this year that no one planned for, we've seen with our clients who had those established relationships with their tenants from a landlord perspective, that they were able to move faster and think about what they needed to do as people were going out of spaces across asset classes, starting to come back, that they kind of had that established rapport. On the other side, we've seen with clients who are maybe just getting started as it relates to green leasing, energy aligned clauses, maybe they're doing it for investor reporting or other considerations and really trying to think about how they can set and achieve their long-term targets. We have it's been nonstop in terms of the demand to really set up the right framework as companies can move forward. So really kind of the last 4 months has been all about putting this into practice, continuing to roll it out. We haven't really seen a pause in kind of the application of this. And then kind of the new entrants, people are starting to think about this for the first time, are trying to really think about the structure as it relates to energy as well as health and well-being.
Great, thanks, Harry. Stuart or Matt, would either one of you want to answer the question again? I'll repeat it. What has been a major focus over the past 4 months related to leasing and efficiency?
Well, what I've seen in the last 4 months, as you can imagine, particularly in New York, the leasing market has been fairly dormant. What we're seeing is we're seeing very few new leases. To the extent tenants are continuing to occupy space, they're either renewing leases or they're not. But we're not seeing tenants move to new space. It's kind of an interesting thing. There are no kind of attractive buildings that people are targeting to move. So we're really seeing, the only kind of niches that are moving, private equity firms, hedge funds, who are taking advantage of market opportunities, and then a unicorn like a Peloton, who's just exploding, in the COVID world. So landlords have been focused not so much on sustainability and carbon reduction as much as they have been on, in my opinion, creating efficiencies on the use of energies through zones, and energy floor by floor energy consumption and sources, as opposed to the more conventional base building systems. And we'll get into later how that I think is going to create some opportunities. But in the dormancy of the leasing world right now, there may be some recalibration or opportunity, at least, to recalibrate going forward how landlords and tenants can collaborate on the green lease concepts that Audi started to talk about, and then we'll talk about further.
Thank you. Matt, would you like to weigh in?
Sure. It's good to be on the call with you all. I'm excited to participate in this conversation. My name is Matt Praske. I am the Director of Energy and Sustainability for Wash REIT, so I'll do my best to share my perspective from the owner side of someone who we own office, multifamily, and retail in the DC, Maryland, and Virginia area. I'll echo what Stuart said in terms of leasing volume being limited over the last several months. But what we have been hearing, if there is any trend, it is in tenant education, right? Whether that's our existing tenants discussing renewal, existing tenants discussing property or building reoccupancy, or some prospective tenants looking at new space. They have new vocab, right? They're hearing things and they're asking us about it. And so we're being forced to respond, or we're given opportunity to respond and share our knowledge. It's a new set of topics around health and safety in the built environment. They're asking questions around filtration of air. What's the recirculation of air? Lots of topics like that about what is their exposure and what is the building able to do to mitigate any sort of negative impacts. So far, that discussion and what we're able to provide, at least on the tenant side, while it's great they're getting informed on these topics, not yet a connection between those and efficiency. They aren't asking the questions of us yet in terms of, hey, what are the implications of those viral mitigation strategies on efficiency, and what costs are either borne by the landlord or tenant. So that's sort of been the trend over the last couple of months.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think for context and those that are on this webinar, the reason why we're having discussion with the panelists is because, when we're looking at efficiency and resiliency, there's often a disconnect between many parties that make the decision. And so through this discussion, we really want to kind of analyze from a sustainability consultant perspective, a building operator owner, and a leasing attorney, how does this all come together? Or how should we be thinking about all of this coming together? And what could be a new version or processes that we can start to adopt into 2021? So kind of taking a step back, in April, May, June, and July, when buildings were essentially vacant, we saw that there wasn't a lot of energy reduction in buildings. And, from my perspective, I have my opinions, but I wonder, when we're looking at landlords and tenants and how the traditional lease really didn't address efficiency in an efficient way, do you think there's an opportunity here for owners and operators of these buildings to start to set new parameters that put more control in the building owners and those that operate them, to minimize tenant usage, or at least control it more so that it becomes a more efficient building, whether it's through building controls or having more regulation on when systems turn on and off and weekend use? Sure.
Yeah, I think, and Audrey, you and I have discussed this. I think there's a tremendous opportunity right now. Again, this is part of the collateral damage or benefit of COVID. Because everything has been kind of put on hold, everyone's pressed the pause button. Now is a great opportunity for landlords and owners to be rethinking how they can become more efficient in energy, and how they can run buildings in a way that's going to accommodate tenants' need for more flexibility. One of the things that I'm seeing tenants looking at in the future is, how can I be as nimble as possible to either track my space, expand my space, but simply dealing with the unknown. So I think that there is kind of an unintended door that's being opened by virtue of the COVID, lack of occupancy, the disruption has created the opportunity to possibly inject a more collaborative approach to how landlords and tenants are working in buildings. What's kind of interesting is, one of the things we saw in COVID was that landlords and tenants had to deal with rent relief. And so the first thing we saw in March and April was just, a plethora of negotiations on, well, how do I deal with the next 3 months rent? And that put landlords and tenants in a kind of a collaborative, more often than not, interesting to hear Matt's perspective on this, but in a much more collaborative environment. They kind of had to work together in this crisis, because the tenants were not excused from rent payments by virtue of force majeure clause. That didn't help payment. That didn't help payment. They couldn't look to their business interruption insurance to get reimbursed for rent. So landlords and tenants really had to kind of work in the same atmosphere, so to speak, to solve that problem. And I think that there will be a lingering culture of collaboration as we move back into the second and third quarter of 21, that may lend itself, if we're fortunate, to a more, again, a more partnership-oriented view towards the landlord-tenant relationship, and possibly less antagonistic.
Yeah, I'll note that Audi, to your question, is the premise there is exactly right. While our occupancy in most buildings is down 70 or 80%, consumption is down on average 20%, right? So there's, and that's not necessarily due to a problem with a traditional lease. It is the nature of building systems, right? If you have a couple people on a floor, we have to deliver a conditioned space to them, and we may need to still operate, depending on the building, if it's a floor by floor unit or central plant, to run the HVAC requires, it's not a one-to-one relationship there in the occupancy and the energy use. The resolving that, I don't know if it's necessarily going to be that the owners and operators want to push for more control of those operations, but we want to make sure our leases and our tenant relationships, both formally and informally, allow for the flexibility, right? That as occupancy, whether we have occupancy sensors or our access data of key fobs and such, allow us to be aware of where people are in the space, in the building. Are we able to be more flexible and nimble with the HVAC operations and the conditioning that we're delivering? That flexibility, hopefully, is, as Stuart's saying, comes with collaboration, that we're using the means to communicate to tenants, that the tenants are letting us know in advance who's going to be in the space, or give us some advance notice. So when we don't need to operate, we don't have to, even if the lease says, from 9 to 5, you're delivering, a 72-degree conditioned space. And through that, we're able to communicate why that's not only to our advantage, but to the tenants as well.
Yeah, and wanted to comment on what Stuart mentioned in some of the renegotiation that's happened or is still happening. That, oftentimes people think about green leasing as a sort of, you only have this one shot up front when signing a new lease. And, historically leases have been 5, 10, 20, years. That's sort of a long time to not be able to refresh, so a lease. And we've actually seen some examples during the pandemic as landlords were renegotiating terms with tenants that they put in some of these clauses that they historically hadn't been able to put in. So within their broader environmental social governance or ESG strategy and program, that they do feel accountable for the whole building's consumption and know that there were tenants that were more challenging from an energy consumption standpoint. That we did have some examples in California and kind of on the West Coast on the retail side of landlords using this as a chance to integrate a green lease where they hadn't in sort of 5 years ago when they signed the original lease with the tenant. So using this again as an opportunity, we've seen that play out in practice.
So we actually have a question from an audience here, and same question for me. I hear that often those that are renegotiating a lease don't want to rock the boat, right? They just want to get it done, renegotiate it, move forward. With that in mind, any of you on the panel, what might be like 1 to 3 items that you think are appropriate or would want to push right now to ensure those quick lease negotiations are incorporated into the conversation?
Are you talking about, I'm trying to understand the question a little better in terms of as you're renegotiating a lease right now, what 2 or 3 items with respect to resiliency or sustainability? Yeah. So interestingly, from the New York perspective, and we may get into this a little further down, as many of you know, New York recently passed Local Law 97, which is New York's carbon reduction law, an extremely aggressive law, and came in the wake of really the 2018 midterm elections and the success of the progressive wing. And these things are only happening at the local level. But I don't want to digress too far into Local Law 97 now. So I think that there is an opportunity, if landlords are attuned to it, I think that with respect to, depending on where the leverage balance lies, landlords may be able to inject into their lease some provisions which may deal with, in terms of Local Law 97, for example, having tenants participate in the costs to possibly retrofit buildings, and we would be doing this through operating expense provisions. So landlords could look at those provisions, see if there's something in there that may be able to pass through to tenants a more equitable share of what they would otherwise not be able to pass through to tenants. And tenants at the same time could be asking landlords to institute certain calibrations in common areas. Again, if the tenants have certain ESG objectives, then it may be asking landlords to be more mindful and to actually do commission agreements, recommissioning, and studies on a more periodic basis. So those are just a couple of ideas that may work way towards some renegotiations.
Yeah, a quick win we've seen in the renegotiation process, and which is a challenge nationally, and again varies market by market depending on utility providers, is access to data. So many landlords cannot get their tenants' data, and they just sort of have the common area. This creates a whole slew of issues in sort of ESG reporting for clients. But that is sort of a collaborative sense to really be able to at least baseline where the whole building or whole asset is operating. And often tenants just haven't been asked before for that information. And this is something when you sort of provide the context as to why you're asking, because you want to think of collaborative ways to drive down costs. At a minimum, just sort of starting with first principles or super basic requests around access to data can actually bring a lot of these sort of maybe harder issues or financial issues to the light by having that core information.
Yeah, we and in return, right, if we're collaborating here, hopefully what we're able to offer in return, your tenants providing us the data, and in return we are willing and more able to share information on the building performance with you, tenant, right? We will share with you the building's Energy Star score. Candidly, we want to be asked what our building's Energy Star scores are, right? We don't want to, we generally speaking, hopefully, if we're doing our job well, it's a good story. Even if the score might be lower, we're able to show you a trend that says, hey, we are best in class. This gives us an opportunity to share with you the progress we're making, right? So hopefully we're making that a two-way street in terms of you're sharing data with us and we're sharing information back with you, either on the building's performance or the certifications that we're able to achieve, Energy Star, LEED, or others, through the use of that data.
That's great. I actually have a question from an audience member to you, Matt, that asked, what are the main resources you are turning to in order to educate tenants who are asking for information from you? Like, I guess, emails.
So if this is related to the information that we've been, or the information requests we've had from tenants and prospective tenants over the last several months, it's a couple sources. First, we're relying heavily on expert guidance, and this is around COVID impacts, right, and virus mitigation, and appropriate operation of the buildings. We're relying on CDC and ASHRAE guidance. We're starting there. We're relying on our key partners, our indoor air quality and indoor environmental quality, industrial hygienists, to verify and validate the information. And then a lot of industry peer sharing of best practices or what's working, using those to provide, sort of distill appropriate information back to our tenants that we feel is vetted, that has scientific rigor, without over promising or over extending what it is we're able to make clear about the spaces where people are working.
That's great. We've got some really great questions come in. So thank you everybody that's asking questions. I'm going to get to those in a minute. I have a couple more questions first before we dive into them. So we've been talking a lot about tenants and getting them engaged and sharing information. What about when we're talking about efficiency and resiliency? Do you think there will be, and maybe Matt or anybody on the panel, a requirement for tenants to be more accountable for their energy use, more pressure to take accountability for each tenant and how they design and operate their spaces?
Yes, I mean, the short answer is yes. What the level of that accountability will entail is still to be determined. I think the word we'd use to say that we are trending towards is more partnership, right? A partnership in the energy use and energy performance of the building. Again, that goes to the idea of sharing the data so that we have the data we need to make tenants aware of the building performance, and that's only trending upward, right? In our ability, thanks to technology, to share more detailed and granular data with tenants, such that they can be, if not directly financially accountable, they can be aware of, and we can part with them, hopefully using the resources we have as landlords to provide them some guidance and say, here, these are some targeted and specific actions you can take to assist us. I'll sort of I'm curious what Stuart or Harry think in terms of whether or not that can be ratcheted up a level in terms of direct accountability. I think that's still an open question, and it depends on lease structures as they vary in different markets, right?
Well, I do think that it is going to ultimately, many of these problems are going to need to be market driven. And I think we all have to recognize that that is ultimately what's going to determine where these collaboration efforts meet and don't meet. And often the market is driven by, in this case, or in the case of, again, Local Law 97, a very aggressive law that's been instituted, without which I think that there would be very little incentive in the market to reduce the carbon footprint. So to kind of get back to the question, I think that that's going to require automatically some measure of collaboration, as landlords are now faced with an extremely expensive capital cost in front of them. That they're going to have to pass that on to some extent to tenants. And I think it's going to be very interesting. And when I say pass on, that's where the collaboration comes. Landlords and tenants are going to have to face this problem together. It's not simply a landlord problem that tenants can throw their hands up and say, not my problem, I'm paying you a gross amount for space. You deal with it, landlord. What's going to happen is, as landlords are over time beginning to deal with this problem, it's going to have to work its way into the lease somehow, just by virtue of the market force, because landlords are not going to be, they're going to be in a position to not being able to absorb the excess capital cost, and that's somehow going to have to be passed on to the tenant, and that's going to create a collaboration platform that didn't exist otherwise.
Yeah, and sort of something we've seen that we're excited about, particularly within the green leasing language, is sort of the requirements as costs for renewables in certain markets have come down significantly, particularly as it relates to on-site solar. Within green leasing, the requirement that tenants use the solar power within sort of the installation, that if a landlord is considering, if they sort of have a large footprint, and we see this in logistics or big box retail, where they are investing, and depending if it's a triple net lease or however it's structured, if they're investing in some type of renewable technology, that they have the end user as the tenant structured in the lease, and to be putting that type of language in the lease up front, even if there's no immediate plan to install some type of renewable, that you are set up for success later. We view sort of the green leasing clauses, particularly in that vein, as so much more forward looking, because who knows what sort of technology will come next and what sort of the market price will be. But we've seen, again, out west, a lot of clients now re-looking at renewables that maybe sort of passed on them a few years ago, and putting that into the lease, saying that they sort of know that that's coming next. And that's sort of a great way to, I think, make the financial case further for some of that technology.
Yeah, and I think, kind of bringing all this together, between cities adopting more advanced policies to drive efficiency in buildings, coming out of where we are in current conditions with the buildings partially occupied and efficiency challenges, the growth of interest and adoption of environmental and social goals, whether it's the owner or the tenant, is certainly contributing to a greater demand and addressing inefficiencies in the lease space. So here, I'd like to get your perspective from, I think you've got clients across the United States. Where do you see the most amount of activity in trying to address efficiency and sustainability in the lease space through the clients that you work with?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the markets that have taken up, aggressive legislation around carbon and efficiency in New York City, local law 97, DC has equivalent. 16 cities around the country are really sort of looking to ramp up the sort of performance element there, that the sort of the larger landlords are very much attuned to what's coming in the regulatory pipeline and are starting to think about, okay, how do we plan for this and build in these costs and really think about tenant improvement funding and what being a little more directed, what that should go towards, and having more detailed specifications as to what they want, built out within their space, because they know, and as it's structured in, New York, for example, the landlord is ultimately accountable for paying any potential fine for not complying, and that they need to be mindful when tenants are, re-signing leases in existing spaces, or, again, a bit of a slowdown, sort of moving into new spaces, that they are getting it right up front and they're taking advantage of some local incentives from utilities or state agencies to fund those programs. There's so much money out there that can bring down the cost significantly of setting up space to be more efficient. So, really kind of the markets where there's legislation, that's probably the most where we're seeing it. But we do have clients who have this sort of national footprint that are thinking about where they can apply it. And this is advantageous as a differentiator to attract tenants that do value, those goals.
Anybody else want to weigh in?
I think you're going to see a real dichotomy in the market, and New York is a great petri dish for it, because there is almost, 500 million square feet of office space in New York, and you have such a diversity of ownership from institutional to kind of mom and pop. And I think, picking up on what Harry said, you do have a number of institutional owners who are aware of what's coming down the pipeline. But one of the aspects of the carbon reduction laws that I'm kind of curious about seeing how it's going to play out is the fact that they really don't take effect until several years from now. So that, for example, New York's carbon reduction law, the first time a landlord has to actually submit a piece of paper to the city to comply with that law is 2025. So, which is going to be a summary of basically the carbon output from 2024. So, human nature is such where, if the problem's not facing me immediately, I have other things to deal with and other things to worry about. That's what I'm seeing to some extent out in the kind of more neutral commercial world. And the first thing I saw in April and May of 19, clients were calling me and they're saying, what's the fine? How much is the fine? How much is the fine? So you could see the focus was not on trying to fix the problem initially. It was on trying to fix it and throw money at the problem by paying a fine. I think that maybe, I don't want to be Pollyannish, but I think that's going to change. I hope it's going to change, because ultimately the fines ramp up, they get more expensive. But it goes back to this kind of window of opportunity I see when things start to ramp up again in the third and fourth quarter of 21, to really see how landlords, once tenants start to come back into the marketplace in a more robust fashion, to see how landlords are actually going to react to the compliance requirements, and to see if they're actually going to try to fashion lease provisions, as we've already tried to do in some cases, that create a sharing of that additional capital burden.
I just want to add one quick point. You've heard us talk a lot about New York's local law 97, DC's building energy performance standard, and that's just because these are the rulemaking there, and they're rolling out right now, and they're active and they're top of mind. But if you own assets elsewhere, those aren't the only reasons, or if you're not in those geographies, you get to ignore this. There are many other jurisdictions that have benchmarking disclosure requirements, and even outside of that, at least for us as a public REIT, we have lots of investor pressure to demonstrate long-term energy and carbon reduction progress. So, absolutely those regulatory schemes are top of mind and are driving the conversation and key aspect today. But there are any number of other drivers that are sort of pushing us in this direction outside of just that.
So can we continue that conversation, Matt, with you and dive into how, as Director of Sustainability at Wash REIT, the priorities from your investors and how you look at sustainability has kind of trickled down to green leasing, engaging with your attorneys internally, and then ultimately gaining recognition under the Green Lease Leaders Program. Just for anybody that's like new to green leasing, how do you even approach it?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of our reason in pursuing Green Lease Leaders was beyond just the benefits we get in having these terms and conditions in our leases. It was also a tool for us to affect some organizational change, to build some internal capacity, right? That here's a framework that we can use that is industry standard, right? That's really helpful when we take something new to our teams and we say, look, I can point to all of our peers who are using the same framework. And we introduce this and we put that in front of our leasing team, in front of legal, in front of property management. Now we're all using the same language and the same terms. Everyone understands the same concepts and the goals of what we're trying to achieve. So, there's an education component to that, internal education, making sure folks are, that takes a little bit of time to get everyone sort of just comfortable with something that's might be new or different, or there's that concern that will this disrupt or challenge a future lease negotiation. But generally speaking, once we're able to sort of, again, point to that using Green Lease Leaders at an industry standard, that helps provide some comfort. And then that's been wholly beneficial to us that across the organization, folks outside of just sustainability are now familiar with these concepts.
So it sounds to me green leasing is some part setting those, what are the drivers for you, some internal education about the reasoning why and understanding, and that starts to help to frame out and make it possible for an organization to start adopting green leasing.
Yeah, it's certainly really helpful to get started by identifying the objective and making sure folks are all on the same page of the reason behind doing it. Winning an award on its own, getting recognition on its own can be a good enough reason by itself. Look, we're all looking for content to fill our sustainability web pages or have reason or ways to communicate to tenants and other stakeholders our sustainability credentials. So, getting recognition alone can be the reason. But I think you'll quickly find out in those conversations that it is a tool we need in our toolbox to deliver on our broader ESG commitments.
Great. So do you think green leasing, it's been around for quite some time actually, but it's a fairly new term. Do you think that we're going to start seeing green leasing accelerate in the next year or so? Even if it's a transaction is not called green, but elements are in there. Do you see that transition starting to happen? Stuart, I'll ask you first.
Well, first of all, my personal recommendation is I think we should get away from the label of green leasing. I think it's kryptonite, but that's my own let's call it, sustainable or
energy aligned.
Energy aligned. I think of this as, and I'm a generation older than most of you, when the American Disabilities Act came out in early mid 80s. That was a federal statute, so there was an advantage to that. But at first, people kind of recoiled at it, and eventually, I think there became a cultural acceptance of the need to address disabled populations. And that worked its way into buildings. And now, again, it had the benefit of having a federal mandate behind it. But I do think that with ESG objectives and, where the cultural developments and a more progressive mindset, I do think that there is an opportunity for green leasing to become more expansive. And I do think it's a top-down process. You're seeing top financial institutions. I'm seeing them through certain clients that I have who are insisting upon, at least now, the use by tenants of sustainable materials, the compliance with recycling methodologies, the compliance with if a building is LEED certified, the tenants have to adhere to maintain that status. So I do see it moving. I'm concerned that things are so economically driven that it's going to take some time to get back on our feet after COVID. But I think when that happens, I think that the pieces are in place for there to be a really good opportunity for green leasing. Last time I'll say it, to come to the fore.
Harry, you do you do a lot of speaking engagements and workshops. Do you see the request for you to talk about green leasing, high performance buildings growing?
Yeah, and I think what we've been excited about, on this in our conversations, this is my favorite engagement. This is my favorite panel and co-panelist by far of COVID. But that what we see a lot of the conversation is it's actually, as mentioned, top down, that executives are asking this question. Investor relations professionals are asking this question. Sustainability practitioners are asking this question. How do we have targets that are aligned with the Paris Climate Accords? That's been a big investor push. Tenants, again, as mentioned earlier, are getting more sophisticated on these topics. And how can we actually implement practices to make credible long-term goals? You have to actually have a plan in place. It's no longer sort of a check the box. Okay, we're going to get there somehow. What is your specific plan? And we're seeing kind of more stakeholders within an organization, whether that's leasing teams, legal, asset management, property management, getting involved to actually understand this, that when you kind of have that tone at the top, this is important to us, we want to actually implement it and use this as a way to differentiate ourselves, that we're seeing it percolate a lot more within organizations. And, again, I think that recognition piece, reporting programs like the Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark, GRES, the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment, UNPRI, these programs that require landlords to submit their information and they're compared against their peers have also gotten more sophisticated. Even what they ask specifically around, leasing clauses, and landlords want to meet those expectations. And on the same side, tenants are putting out their own sustainability and ESG reports. And the most sort of cost-effective and truly impactful way to demonstrate year-over-year progress in reducing their own impact. And we deal with a lot of financial services clients who have big data centers and office footprints, is energy efficiency. That you can sort of buy renewable energy credits and carbon offsets to fill the gap. But sort of the first recommended step that continues to be the best practice is to invest in your own spaces and drive down your direct impact. So we're hearing it kind of from the stakeholders, the investors, general public side, from landlords who have their own goals and commitments, and then sort of that maybe bottom up like tenant push, that how are we going to get better? How are we going to show year-over-year progress? I don't think the tenants are maybe totally there or asking for green leasing yet. I think it's still pushed probably more by the landlord who's putting it out there. But I think there's more openness to understanding why this is just a lease, not necessarily a green lease. This is just standard language that should be in a lease, and you only get it if you ask for it and put it in there.
Great, thank you. I have a question from the audience that talks about cost recovery charges. Understanding that there are various types of leases out there. You've got triple net, you've got gross. How can someone start to think about this? And I think there might be different situations based on city. Matt or Stuart, you can talk about like cost recovery clause, but how could somebody think about approaching cost share for efficiency in buildings based on various leasing types?
Yeah, so one of the things that I've been focusing on recently is the operating expense provision. I deal primarily with office leases that are gross leases, so that landlords pass through operating expenses, and that's a very loaded definition, to tenants. And the significant operating expense that would have to be passed through here in this case in order to comply with carbon reduction would be basically the retrofitting of base building systems, which is obviously a significant number. And in a typical operating expense provision, the capital expenses that can be passed through the tenant are very limited. They're generally, 2 or 3 buckets at most. One, in order to comply with new laws. Well, that's interesting. When you talk about laws that are going into effect, are they in effect? Are they new? So that's a whole other discussion. We'll have a webinar on that. The other bucket are cost-saving measures, so that capital improvements that basically reduce operating costs in the building can be passed through to the tenant. Now, these are passed through on an amortized basis, so over the useful life or over the term of the lease, so that tenants aren't getting the total hit. I do think that recently we're starting to see life safety costs passed through to tenants in these capital expense provisions, and it was kind of a little under the radar. And these might have been, fire prevention, fire suppression systems, security systems. So I do think that there is one way to pass the cost through will be through these operating expenses. And it may simply be a matter of, and as Harry's alluded to, the whole notion of everybody or more people becoming more cognizant of, the desirability of efficiency leases. And landlords may be able to say, okay, so in addition to new laws, cost-saving measures, life safety, anything reducing carbon reduction, capital improvements can now be passed through the tenants. We'll have to see. But I think that's one way to move those costs and to a more shared basis.
Stuart, so that's around the cost of compliance by implementing efficiency measures and those that reduce the OpEx. Can you speak to what sort of standard language there is, or for the cost of fines for buildings that don't comply and are subject to those fines, and whether or not who bears responsibility there?
Sure. I suspect, Matt, that you would not be able to show me one lease in your portfolio where the tenant bears the cost of the fine. Meaning that no, the landlord right now, if there are fines imposed, landlords would typically, under a typical operating expense provision, bear those costs. But that's another arena where you can start to shift the burden, particularly if tenants are operating their energy consumption on a floor-by-floor basis. What we start to do in leases, again, with Local Law 97, we've put in language. I can tell you I'm not quite sure how this is going to play out because I haven't seen it play out yet, but that if the tenant's consumption causes a pro rata increase to exceed the acceptable cap and therefore triggers a fine, the tenant will be responsible for its pro rata portion of the fine that's attributable to their excess consumption. And again, it's easy to talk about these things, the devil's in the detail and how it works operationally. Obviously, if you have, space by space, floor by floor sources and consumption, it's much easier than a more conventional base building system structure. I don't know if that was responsive.
Yeah, and I think what you're getting at there is that quickly leads us into what you can imagine be a quite a more antagonistic relationship between landlord and tenant, right? If we're saying we've been measuring this and we think your excess is contributing to the building's non-compliance, and we have to determine pro rata share of those expenses, that's much more antagonistic, right? So that's where we're would much prefer to be in a proactive partnership and collaboration sort of structure than what Stuart's describing there, but he's totally correct. Time will tell.
But remember, Matt, I'm in New York. Antagonism is part of our culture.
Fair point.
Yeah, but Matt, I think that's a really good point. We're going in a very different direction than traditional leases can support. With policy, with new standards, with ESG priorities, this has to change, right? And I think what Stuart described is kind of like the end all. If you don't work together, this is the repercussions. And so what is the language and what's the relationship that you establish so that you both can work together to have an efficient, healthy building and ensure that everybody's working together and meeting the set goals. But, as Stuart said, there needs to be at some point some level setting and say, you're not playing by the rules. We're not working together, and this is how we need to address it. I do have a question from an audience member here that says most of these approaches sound like they are being done in Class A office buildings. What is the progress in less expensive Class B and C buildings for using green leasing? Some recommendations there.
Well, I'll just say quickly, we have our standard office lease template, which has these green lease provisions in it, and we use that across the whole organization. And Wash REIT owns Class A, B, and C properties, so these apply to Class A buildings in downtown DC, as well as our suburban office park assets. And certainly there's some differences in familiarity or it's less likely in some of those spaces where being requested for that, or where it's the sustainability or ESG provisions are a priority for that tenant. But I don't think, at least in the DC market, we have not seen a substantial differentiation on sort of appetite for green leases across class of building.
I see it a little differently than Matt in New York. I think there's a much more delineated distinction between Class A properties and who owns Class A properties and Class B properties. And the Class B properties, I think, much more heavily challenged to comply. And it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out, because the priorities generally of the owners of Class B buildings are not quite as aligned, in my experience, with sustainability and carbon reduction as those institutions who are motivated by ESG, et cetera, that are more amenable to kind of moving in the direction of leases.
Very different question, and I think it goes to Stuart, your frustration. Just to put it out there, any thoughts on changing, if you were not to refer to green leasing, what would you rather it be titled? High performance leasing, sustainability leasing? Any thoughts on that?
really, you shouldn't make a suggestion unless you have a solution, right? That you're right about that already. I don't know I don't have an answer because I don't really have a preference. I think there are any number of labels you can put on it. I just think that politics has made, the word green, unfortunately, a little bit before, like kryptonite. And people hear green and they just start to think about, moving everything to communism. Not, better or worse. I think that's just a reality. I don't think it's a make or break, but it just kind of occurred to me as we're going through this and I was preparing for all this, and just reading a few articles about Local 97 and outing it as part of the Green New Deal in New York, and the mayor is very proud of that, and that's fine and good. And the great thing is we've got a very aggressive carbon reduction law on the books. So that's the bottom line. The rest is kind of politics and optics. But I do think that to advance the cause, so to speak, I think it would just be beneficial to think of something other than green. But I'll get back to you on my suggestion.
So I think this raises an interesting question, which is from a strategic perspective, does it work better to highlight it, to call it out, to label it a green lease or whatever you want to call it, to maybe even, and I think there's another question in the queue that's, should those bucket of clauses all be sort of bundled up together as the green clauses in an addendum? So highlighting it, or do you not? Do you just say, this is a standard lease, we include these and that's all there is? I don't know. I think Harry was touching on this, right? That if we were able to just incorporate them as standard and it doesn't need a special designation, is that better or worse? I don't know. I think it's possible, different tenants would respond better to one than the other, but it kind of raises that question. I don't know the answer to that, but that those are two different paths you could take there.
Yeah, I mean, our client feedback and sort of pushback at times of sort of recommending different, we'll call them lease clauses. We'll stick with lease clauses for the moment on this topic. Has been, if they're doing it as an amendment, again, sort of mid-lease, you are calling them come out, and we saw that again earlier this year during kind of the COVID context. But I do think the sort of the integration, is sort of the way to go. My one sort of caveat or take on this is for tenants, and this may be in certain markets or certain types of tenants who would find this being called out as attractive, that it's sort of not necessarily a negative. Obviously, there's a financial component with the energy cost recovery clause, but it's another communication channel to a tenant from a landlord, in addition to a sustainability and ESG report or a web page or sort of one pager about an asset, that we take this seriously and that we're not bearing it. We are sort of proud of this, and we want you as a tenant and sort of kind of the two-way relationship to be set up for long-term success. Coming back to the sort of regulatory component, and again, this is probably more on the institutional Class A side, but landlords are not really rejecting tenants currently who are qualified, but it is a long-term risk if you have this super energy intensive tenant that's not willing to work with you. You do have to factor in potential fines and input. So to, on balance, I think it's about integration ultimately, and that's the path to go, but it can be sort of a marketing or communication tool when on its own.
So I'm going to use this as a chance to plug Green Lease Leaders. Green Lease Leaders is a recognition program. Green leasing, the term green leasing, like I said, has been around for quite some time. It's been adopted by this program. It's become a standard in which you can follow if you want to figure out how to integrate efficiency clauses, sustainability in practice. To date, or at least this year, we've recognized about 1 billion square feet of lease space That does include government, commercial real estate, retail, and industrial as part of this portfolio. And since 2014, we've recognized about 3 billion square feet of lease spaces. So whether you're a Class A, B, C, it provides the fundamentals and the basics. And for companies that are just getting started, you could look to start by just going to the website, greenleaseleaders.com, and take a quick audit about your leasing practices. And it just outlines where you are and some recommendations to start incorporating some of these practices into your lease and operations. One-on-one assistance is provided through IMT, and that can either be to help apply for Green Lease Leaders recognition or just get started in incorporating a new type of lease practice. And for those of you that are looking for recognition, the deadline is by March 31st of 2021. So with that, I'd like to also, now I can't see my screen, sorry. Stop sharing here. I do have some questions for kind of round out a lot of this discussion here. We haven't really talked about how buildings have shifted a little bit as far as what they're doing to address community needs. So kind of going back to resiliency and adoption and changes to what current needs are for the community. Matt or Harry, have you seen some new adoption of building use for whether it was for voting or donation?
Yeah, I mean, you know, our when we think about the WashREIT's impact in our community, you know, our asset is in many cases the physical space, right? That's what we have, and we are aware of that and looking for ways to use that to contribute. I'll tell one quick sort of case study. That's a unique project we completed last year. We installed solar panels on the roof of our corporate headquarters. And in fact, we didn't really install them. We provided the roof space for that. We said, we have this space, it's not being used otherwise. We partnered with a nonprofit entity who owned and installed the panels. And any of the electricity that gets produced by those panels gets credited to low-income families in the district. So look, it was a great opportunity to get another sustainability project done, at the same time serving a social good as well. And again, that was our way of saying, what do we have? We have some space. How can we use it to benefit the community? More broadly speaking, I think that's on our minds of how can we use our spaces either to provide those ancillary services either to our tenants, our residents, or the community. And that's now certainly we have some rethinking to do in terms in a from a public health perspective now of you know, controlling access and crowds and such. But generally speaking, that is absolutely the trend, whether that's our launching a tenant engagement app. So all the tenants in our buildings have access and can use and make more efficient use of their time, if not also the space, to have somewhat concierge services linked with the building. So a long way of saying yes, and we're always looking at better ways to use our space and connect our building and our building occupants to the community.
Yeah, we've seen with clients, while you know there's been that significant disconnect between you know physical occupancy and the drop in energy consumption, you know, due to sort of capital constraints, not as many projects happening when the buildings have been close to vacant as one would hope. I mean, I don't think it's sort of happened in practice. On the social side, we've seen some really, you know, impactful uses of this vacant space, whether that's kind of parking lots for drive-through testing. Our clients have been sort of active in seeking out partners to do that, in sort of large, you know, office type tenants who have cafeterias that would normally serve their own office population. So many challenges around food insecurity, happening at the moment, and leveraging those kitchens to really serve the community. And, the landlords, the tenants, has been super collaborative of sort of donations to those causes, and how that physical asset and space that's being underutilized for its traditional purpose can be used for community needs. So we've seen, in the real estate sector and with tenants too, really sort of stepping up their strategic corporate philanthropy during COVID, and using the built environment as a way to amplify their impact.
Great, thank you. I think we've come to the end of questions here. Thank you everyone for participating. I think this was a very informative session. I'd like to give the panelists a chance to kind of round out the conversation, and thinking in the 2021, what do you hope to really focus on in your particular roles that is different than what you've done in the past?
Well, I guess I'll start. First, it's really kind of getting everybody back on their feet, which is going to be a challenge, I think. And I think that there is a little bit of mid-level anxiety in the market with respect to the ultimate effect of what the COVID at home experience, how that's going to translate into ultimate inventory and office use for users down the road. So that's going to be something that's going to drive, I think, so many decisions that it's going to be challenging to kind of weed through that and get to the resiliency issues that we've been talking about today. But one of the things that I do think, as I mentioned before, is very ripe in my practice is to draw landlords and tenants together for purposes of addressing local law 97, the carbon reduction. I mean, it is the single biggest carbon reduction undertaking in the country, just by sheer volume. And I think that that's something that's going to, once landlords wake up after the crisis and get back to some sense of a new normal, that's going to start to move front and center. So I'm really excited to see how leases are going to address that. And I've got my thoughts and ideas, and I'm hoping that other practitioners will share that and be amenable to that. But that's kind of number one on my plate.
I think to the extent the past, I'll echo that. That is priority for us as well in DC. But I will say one of our priorities will be to the extent that the past year has been disruptive and forced us to, it really strains resources and availability of time and what to focus on. We're hoping to be able to refocus on our long term, right? Make sure we're staying focused on those things that contribute to our 10-year energy reduction targets, our greenhouse gas reduction targets, our climate risk mitigation, the things that have a longer view that out of necessity may have been lower priority over the last several months in dealing with the acute issues. These are the long-term things that are required of a company like Wash REIT to mitigate risk for our investors, for our tenants, for other stakeholders. And so that mostly that means our making sure we're not missing major opportunities, right? So whether that's a building acquisition, a piece of equipment reaching end of life, a major leasing opportunity, vacant space and executing a lease with a tenant. Those are 5, 10, 25, or 30-year decision points, right? So making sure we don't miss any one of those opportunities to affect change and contributing to our ESG commitments, that's really critical, and we're hoping to stay focused on that in 21.
I think taking what we've seen and sort of embracing the change and the sort of call for flexibility and all of that, and what's worked and what hasn't worked during all of this, it is sort of critical. And I would focus on the sort of engagement piece, that this is a two-sided conversation. You said multi-sided. We've taken all stakeholders, but at a minimum, sort of with the landlords and the tenants, that climate change, health and safety, social justice. Those are those have always been there, but have very much been at the forefront of 2020, and how you can incorporate resiliency. The US, or sort of the New York area even specifically, is more sophisticated after Superstorm Sandy. There were sort of things that were known as risks that weren't taken into account. Now we will, be better prepared, hopefully, for never again type of pandemic, but we do not know what the sort of the next challenge will be within the next, time period. And to use, I think there's so much momentum and energy from the landlords and the tenants to kind of figure out something to really use that time. And I mean, so start at the beginning, like knowing who is on the other side of this conversation and having that rapport built out informally can be so powerful during a crisis like this.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, collaboration, partnership, landlords and tenant working together to find that common ground, to get back to the office safely, and really foster a different type of relationship. So I really want to thank the panelists today for joining this conversation. I've learned a lot, and hearing from all of you. And I want to also thank Barbara at the Sustainable Performance Institute for allowing us to have this conversation, and all of you that have joined and provided some really, really great questions for the panelists. And if you continue to have questions on green leasing, please go to greenleaseleaders.com. There's lots of information there, and a way to reach out to IMT for any technical assistance.
Great. Thank you. I want to echo what Audi said, and thank Audi and Stuart, Matt, and Harry for this great and very timely discussion. I think this disruption is making everyone realize how interdependent we are and how collaboration is really the only way we're going to get through this. So I totally appreciate your insight into seeing that and the thread of that's come through this whole discussion. There will be a follow-up to attendees with links to information and more information about the next two webinars, one of which is Dr. Greg Norris looking at carbon and life cycle analysis, going from footprinting to hand printing, and a positive approach for carbon reduction. And then a following webinar focusing on the 27 architecture firms who have met the 70% energy reduction across their portfolio. So that's going to be an interesting kind of lessons learned. So thank you all. Thanks again to the panelists for being so generous with your time, and have a good holiday season.
Thanks all.
Thanks.